All right, so we're going to get started. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest Let's Keep Moving with the APDA series. And I am your host, Tami DeAngelis, and today joining me is Rachel Reynolds. So I'm just going to start by saying this is our latest edition, I guess, of the Let's Keep Moving series. And over the next couple of months, we are going to talk with other healthcare professionals who have a big role in, along with physical therapists, in keeping people moving and keeping people exercising. So we're going to talk with these other healthcare professionals over the next couple of months. So we have occupational therapy coming next month. Speech therapy coming next month, and then occupational therapy. But today we have Rachel, who is a dietitian, coming to us. So before we get started, I'll introduce myself. I'm Tami DeAngelis. I'm a physical therapist at the Center for Neuro Rehab. And we are a center at Boston University where that does clinical care, primarily for people with Parkinson's. We also do research, and we house the APDA National Rehab Resource Center, where we answer questions through a helpline and an email address for any Parkinson's related questions about exercise or rehabilitation. So you can see our contact information there. And we have a toll-free number, 888-606-1688. So if you ever have any questions, please reach out to us. And so one last thing I want to mention before we get into hearing from Rachel is that this is a series that has been going on since April. So we have a lot of content that's available both on the APDA website, but also through a YouTube channel. So if you subscribe on the YouTube channel, you'll actually get notification when another Keep Moving series is published there. So it's a great way to follow with some current content. Most of our content is, really relevant right now to the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and it has some good tips for staying active and keeping up your activity levels despite the challenges that we all face. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rachel. So Rachel Reynolds is an assistant director and senior nutritionist at the Boston University Sargent Choice Nutrition Center. She is a registered dietitian nutritionist and with a master's degree in nutrition. And she has the pleasure of working with many patients, as many that I also work with Parkinson's disease during her time at Boston University. And she is excited to be here with us today. And we are excited to have you, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us, the role of nutrition in keeping active and being able to exercise with Parkinson's. As a physical therapist, helping people exercise and stay active is important and to me and to us and my colleagues at BU here. But nutrition certainly plays a huge role in that. So I'm gonna pass it over to you, but I think to guide our discussion, one of the first questions I have for you is there a particular diet that someone with Parkinson's disease should follow to stay active and to support their exercise program? Yeah. Take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm happy to be here. And it's a great question. And it's a question certainly that, I get a lot as a dietitian. And there is no one specific diet. So there isn't a specific diet for the treatment or of Parkinson's disease. But what we know is that nutrition plays a really important role in general health and also strength, fueling physical activity, and then other issues that come up with Parkinson's disease, like digestion, medication absorption, and other non-movement symptoms. So while there's no specific Parkinson's disease diet, there is still a lot about nutrition that can support someone, especially with an active lifestyle. So I thought I would just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about, what is this balanced nutrition? When we're talking about healthy eating pattern, what does that mean? And so in general, it means including certain health promoting foods, whole grains, vegetables, fruit, dairy or dairy alternatives, protein sources, and then heart healthy sources of fat. And so I thought I would just take a couple minutes to talk through, how does this impact in particular physical activity and some of the other questions that sometimes come up around Parkinson's disease. So while I've talked about these, 6 food groups on that last slide, I've included a simpler strategy of thinking about meal planning that would support your active lifestyle. And so this strategy is called meal planning 1, 2, 3. So rather than having to think about all these different kinds of foods, it kind of groups them into these 3 major categories, which can help for meal planning. The first is whole grains and starches. The second is fruits and vegetables. And the third is lean protein and dairy or dairy alternative sources. So I'm going to talk through each of those in terms of how they might impact physical activity in Parkinson's. And this can be a simpler strategy for planning a meal, for example, including 1 item from each category, and can be a nice place to get started for that foundation to support your physical activity. So the first category are the whole grains and starches. These foods provide carbohydrates, which is important because that's the main source of energy that will fuel muscles during physical activity. So carbohydrate is energy that's available to your body right away. It can be helpful to have right before physical activity in order to give someone energy during exercise. In addition, the brain is typically completely dependent on carbohydrate, so it is important for brain function, and it also contains fiber, which can support someone's digestive health. I do have some examples of whole grains and starches in the green box below. It's not an exhaustive list, but some examples that are common that people might be familiar with. That second category that I shared is fruits and vegetables. These also provide carbohydrates. They provide fiber, they provide water. Fruit in particular has more carbohydrates. So in terms of a pre-exercise snack, a fruit would be more helpful than a vegetable in terms of providing that immediate. But both of these fruits and vegetables do provide essential vitamins and minerals, antioxidants, other beneficial plant chemicals that help your body work in general, but also give your body what it needs to use the fuel that it takes in from food and be able to have productive physical activity. I've included lots of examples here. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. Any fruits and vegetables that people like will provide all of these wonderful benefits. And then the third category are protein foods. Protein is important for general health. It's the building block of our cells. But in terms of physical activity, it's particularly essential because we need enough protein for our bodies to be able to repair muscles and therefore build strength with physical activity. That being said, most people in general get more protein than they need and would benefit from choosing more plant sources. And in particular, in Parkinson's disease, it's typically not a goal to be increasing protein intake. And so often we're focused on making sure that someone's getting enough protein so that they can repair muscles and build strength without it being excess protein. So I do have a couple of examples down here, some lean animal sources of protein, as well as some plant sources of protein. And as it says above, sometimes the plant sources are more helpful. They're not quite as high as in protein, and they also provide some other benefits. So I thought it might be helpful just for us to start there, because while there's not a particular Parkinson's disease diet, incorporating these health promoting foods can still create this really nice foundation for health and to support someone who is living an active lifestyle.
Awesome. Thank you. I think one thing you noted on your second slide too is that variety is key. So I think that's a really, really great point. And I think it for those who are maybe less inclined to fill their plates with fruits and vegetables, I think that's a great tip. All right. So my next question for you related to nutrition and movement and exercise. Is there, if you're starting an exercise program, or maybe for people out there, we're hopefully with the pandemic changing, we're getting vaccinations, maybe getting out more, getting to the gym more might be a possibility for some people. So if you're increasing or starting an exercise program, should you change your nutrition? Should you change the way you're eating with Parkinson's?
That's a great question. As with many things with nutrition, everything will be unique to the individual in terms of what changes, might be helpful. In particular, I typically, work with people to make sure that they understand as they're doing more physical activity, they are using more energy, which means that they need to actually eat more in order to have fuel for that physical activity. So one piece that might be a change would be potentially increasing what someone is eating. In addition to that, having something that is based in carbohydrate primarily prior to physical activity can be really helpful to make sure that someone has enough energy, enough fuel for their working muscles during exercise. And so that could be, grains, starches, fruits, things like that.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then, so I have another question. So as I mentioned, we have a helpline at Boston University, and one of our most common questions we'll often get is related to supplements.
Yeah.
So people with Parkinson's want to know, should they be taking supplements? And does that change based on whether or not you're an exerciser? Is there anything additional you need that your standard diet isn't providing? Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, dietary supplements are tricky. Often a multivitamin and mineral that's, age and sex appropriate would be generally recommended. And then sometimes if people have other underlying diagnosed by a physician vitamin deficiencies, there may be, need to supplement there under the physician supervision. But in terms of other supplements, there isn't consistent evidence really saying that there are any supplements that are necessary or beneficial in Parkinson's disease. And so, it's really important for people to be cautious about supplements because sometimes, there are high dose supplements or these sort of like natural or herbal supplements out there that may be geared towards specific disease states or might say, for brain function, but these can actually interfere with medications and they can actually worsen other conditions as well. So in general, if someone is considering supplements for, physical activity or for other, Parkinson's disease related concerns, I would always recommend that they would speak with their healthcare team. And in terms of what someone needs for physical activity from supplements, most people are able to get what they need from food. And so that would be the first place typically that I would start with someone.
Okay, that's a good question. It actually is a good segue into one of our submitted questions that we had. And this question was from Mary from Massachusetts. So not taking sort of pill-based supplements, but she wanted to know if it was necessary to have more protein to exercise. So like a shake, like a protein shake, because it helps build muscle. But I've also heard that it isn't good if you take Cinnamon. So I think what Mary's touching on is the concern regarding the competition for the protein in the absorption of the Cinnamon and interference there. Can you talk with us a little bit about that? Is it necessary to supplement with protein before exercise?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Mary. I think that, initially this, protein that we get from food or from these types of supplements competes with, certain medications, Cinnamon, as you mentioned, for absorption and transport in the blood-brain barrier. So it is something that we need to consider if someone is on these medications. And so in terms of needing more protein for physical activity, as I discussed briefly before, most people are actually getting more protein than they need. And in terms of physical activity, the goals typically are making sure someone is getting enough protein to support, building muscle and repairing muscle and recovery, but not that they're getting excess. And so unfortunately, often, or actually evidence shows us that when people with Parkinson's are taking in excessive protein, meaning more than they need, often their dosage of these medications of Cinnamon will go up, which can be problematic for many reasons, and some of that being, side effects, et cetera. So someone doesn't necessarily need a lot more protein for physical activity. And often we're actually working with people to help them to get enough, but not have it be too much.
Okay. It's a good, so it actually, while you were speaking, I thought of another question, and Christine also had the same question as I did. It makes me think of some of the popular sort of trending diets like the keto diet or the there's sort of different things that you hear a lot about. Is there any concern regarding that? Would the keto diet be appropriate for someone who had Parkinson's and had weight loss goals? Any concerns there? What?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you said it was Christine. So thank you, Christine, for this question. I think with the ketogenic diet, it's really focused on being very low carbohydrate and higher in fat, higher in protein. And there could be potentially a lot of concerns there. One of those concerns being that, excessive protein, which would be common for someone to get more than they actually need from a diet like ketogenic diet, could be problematic because it could interfere with medications, or in general, it's not helpful. We don't need that extra protein. And so, that could be problematic. Also, protein and fat, which are sort of the foundations of the ketogenic diet, do empty more slowly from the stomach. And a very common concern for people with Parkinson's disease is this delayed stomach emptying. And so a diet that's very high in protein, high in fat, people may find that that's actually much more challenging for them in terms of digestion. Similarly, with reducing these higher carbohydrate foods like grains and fruits and sometimes vegetables as well, often someone's fiber intake would go down quite a bit, which might be challenging because often people will experience constipation and other gastrointestinal symptoms.
Okay, so that's a great point. So by focusing so much on the protein with a ketogenic diet, you may be mixing out on other important.
And I guess to clarify too, not everyone with Parkinson's and not everyone who's taking a levodopa containing medication needs to restrict their protein. It's just that most people in general get more than they need already. And evidence shows that for people with Parkinson's disease, we want them to get enough, but not necessarily more than that. And so I like to make that delineation. It's not necessarily a restriction. It's just, not getting more than we need. And so it could have to do, again, it's very individual if people notice that they are, taking medication and they have these moderate motor fluctuations. They may find that it's helpful just to reduce their protein by focusing more on these plant sources versus the animal sources of protein. And then sometimes if people have lots of motor fluctuations, then it may be a time to think more about the timing and the type of protein in a larger way.
Okay, awesome. So you did mention constipation. I have a question from John from Michigan. One of the problems that I have is that I am constipated, and that makes me not want to exercise because I'm uncomfortable. So John does spin classes, so he's a spinner. Okay. So I've heard this is a common thing with Parkinson's disease. Any advice on how to manage with diet?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, John. And this is the most common GI symptom that people with Parkinson's disease will report. And in general, what can be helpful for relieving constipation is for people to aim to get the recommended amount of fiber that they need in a day. So a lot of times that's increasing their fiber. As a reference, for women, the recommendation is 25 grams of fiber per day. For men, the recommendation is 38 grams of fiber per day. And actually, most Americans only get around 15 grams per day. So most people could benefit from getting more. But what's helpful often is increasing fiber slowly. So just to kind of review, as we were talking about earlier, fiber can be found in whole grains, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, beans. So those are some higher fiber foods. So it can be helpful to increase fiber with those foods slowly. So it could be, one new thing at a time, and also increasing fluid. So fluid's going to have a really important role with constipation as well, because, research shows us, as well as lots of experiences with talking with patients, as we increase fiber, if we don't increase fluid at the same time, it actually is counterproductive. So it's having that fiber and that fluid increasing at the same time. A general recommendation for fluid being, around 6 to 8 cups per day. And then a little, with physical activity, our fluid needs do sometimes increase as well. Small frequent meals can also be helpful. in terms of reducing constipation because it helps our body to digest the food we've eaten a little better. Another thing to think about physical activity is that even though high fiber foods are really what we're focusing on and what we might encourage someone to increase to help alleviate constipation, in that immediate, maybe 30 to 60 minutes before physical activity, a lot of times people actually find that lower fiber foods are better tolerated. Because if they eat if they eat all those high fiber foods right before physical activity, that can be really uncomfortable. So it can be helpful sometimes to focus, in that immediate, pre-exercise on the lower fiber foods, and then the rest of the day, having that be the time to bring in the higher fiber foods.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the question, John. And let me just, we have another sort of diet specific question. Is a whole food, plant-based or plant-focused diet more helpful? And that comes from Lindsay.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, it's a great question. So in general, plant foods, in general, I would say for people with Parkinson's, plant foods are beneficial for a lot of reasons. They do provide fiber. They do provide these beneficial plant chemicals like antioxidants and other chemicals that are just good for our general health. And then when we're thinking about the role, the protein piece that we were talking about earlier, plant sources of protein are not absorbed as completely as animal sources, which is a helpful thing in this case, because that actually they have a better carbohydrate to protein ratio, which seems to be more helpful in terms of these other symptoms we're talking about, and then in terms of absorption of the foods and the medication. So it can be helpful. Certainly it still takes some planning to make sure people are getting enough protein, while we don't want them to get more, but plant-based can be helpful.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, and then we have a question from Sharon from Vermont. My husband has had Parkinson's for 10 years and has lost weight. He seems less interested in food now, and it takes him more time to eat.
Yeah.
So I try to encourage him to move every day and go for a walk, but sometimes I think he doesn't have enough energy or interest because he isn't getting enough calories. Any tips on how to know that someone with Parkinson's is getting enough food?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think often people do feel like they have lower energy if they're not taking in enough. Body weight challenges are really common in Parkinson's. And often people find weight loss prior to clinical diagnosis, sometimes a weight increase in those early stages of treatment. But then as Parkinson's disease progresses, unplanned weight loss is associated with increased energy expenditure, which could come from involuntary movement or excessive muscle tone. So there is, it is a common challenge that people find. And the more physical activity someone does, the more energy that they need, the more calories that they need to get from food. So in terms of recommendations, often it can be helpful, especially if someone, as you mentioned, that is experiencing like a disinterest or a poor appetite, having these minor adjustments can be effective. So having, a little addition at a meal or at maybe a couple of eating occasions throughout the day, rather than trying to have, a much bigger meal or to add a large amount of volume of food. It can actually be much more effective to make kind of more smaller changes. Small frequent meals can also be more helpful. It can feel a little bit less overwhelming to have a smaller amount of food in front of someone, and they might be able to feel like they can eat that. And then maybe, more frequently have another small meal. Also, including softer foods can make a really big difference, or alternating, having a bite of food and having some sips of liquid can also help to encourage people to eat a little bit more and to feel like they're able to take in a little bit more food versus something that may take like more chewing, more cutting, that type of thing.
Yeah, and a lot of people I work with do complain. One of the earliest complaints sometimes is the difficulty cutting. And cutting, cutting steak, but and then the time it takes to eat because of some of the motor difficulties. So, do you have any tips for getting around some of that, like the time it takes to eat and the foods that you choose that might be a little more, efficient or easier to get more calories at a meal?
Yeah. Well, I think, what can be helpful is, we didn't talk so much about sources of fat, but sources of fat are going to be more dense with calories. So essentially in a smaller amount, you get more calories. So while it might take a large volume of other types of food for someone to take in more energy, even just adding a little bit of something that's maybe a heart healthy source of fat can be helpful for adding calories. So that could be, nuts and seeds. That could be, an oil like an olive oil or canola oil, or like a salad dressing that's based in one of these oils. And so these are sources where we would just need to add a little bit to actually, get a little more, bang for your buck, so to speak. So you get a little bit more of those calories in a smaller amount. And additionally, things like whole grains and starches tend to be less filling. So sometimes people find that it's easier for them to add a little bit more of those foods to what they're currently eating versus to add something else like one of the, like an animal source of protein would tend to be more filling, or like a raw vegetable or fruit would be a little bit more filling. And then in addition, sometimes people find it helpful to drink something. So we were talking earlier about these like shakes or supplements. And in terms of the things that are, someone would buy from the store, if they were really having a hard time, managing weight loss, that could be something helpful. But I would just recommend that someone looks for one that's on the lower protein, high calorie side versus many of the ones that are out there are high protein. And also people can make smoothies or shakes at home, depending on what they have available to them, where, they can blend up things like, fruits and vegetables, and maybe like a almond milk or something like that, and add things in there that would be able to add some more calories to it.
Okay, awesome. Those are great. And we have a whole bunch of sort of pretty specific questions. If we don't get to all of these, please feel free to email us at rehab@bu.edu with your question, and I can pass it along to Rachel and we can make sure to get an answer for you. But we have time for a couple more. So how about, we have two interesting ones. How about grass-fed beef? So is there any benefit to organic or grass-fed or in terms of our proteins?
Yeah. So, I think in general, when we're talking about something like red meat, it would make a difference in terms of just sort of general health. If someone is eating a leaner cut of meat or a higher fat cut of meat, because in general for health promotion, a leaner source of red meat, which might be like a sirloin or a flank, would be more health promoting in general. And then we also want to consider, in terms of general protein intake, where this might fall for someone in terms of, helping them reach what their protein goals are and making sure that they're not, exceeding those goals. But the question about the grass-fed piece, typically that does change the profile of the fats that are in the meat. So potentially it's varied. So I can't say that, in all cases this would be the case, but a grass-fed beef may have more of the heart healthy sources of fats, and a little bit less of the saturated fat, which is less heart healthy. So that could be potentially, a difference there. But I think we have lots of other considerations around any meat that someone is choosing outside of just the grass-fed versus non-grass-fed.
Okay, great. And so I guess to wrap up, do you have any suggestions for, because we've talked about variety, you gave us some great tips on how to, the 1, 2, 3 meal planning, sort of how you might structure your plate. Do you have any good resources that you would recommend in terms of finding recipes or, interesting ways to bring more vegetables and fruits into your diet if that's not currently something that you feel like you are doing enough of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone is so unique in terms of like what they like for recipes that sometimes it's actually hard to have like one specific place where people can go to get recipes. One thing that I would offer in terms of like fruits and vegetables is that, there's a lot of different ways that we can, bring fruits and vegetables into things that you're already eating. So sometimes it can feel like it's a lot to, add a side dish of vegetables and have to cook a whole separate thing or find a whole new recipe. Sometimes something that you already make might lend itself really well to bring vegetables in. So maybe it's a casserole where, it wouldn't be too hard to increase the amount of vegetables that are in there. So maybe it's the same ones you're already including, but having, adding more to it. Or it could be a pasta dish, which maybe typically is, the pasta itself and a protein and a sauce, but it could be that there's some vegetable that you could actually bring right in to that. Often people find that that is a little bit easier to adapt because it's not this whole extra thing that they're cooking, sort of like an addition to what they're already doing. And so, you know, everyone in general, and certainly everyone who's here has their own way of cooking. They have their own flavor profiles that they like. And so, you know, often that can be a helpful way to bring things in. The one other piece I'll add is that if people do have a microwave, it's actually, there's a lot of really easy ways to prepare vegetables and even things like potatoes and sweet potatoes right in the microwave, which can just make for a much quicker, easier way of preparing food and can make it seem a little bit more achievable versus feeling, you know, like there's a whole bunch of chopping that they need to do, or they have to wait, you know, 45 minutes for something to cook. So that can be something where there's a lot of creativity that you can do with your microwave, in particular with vegetables and starches.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up. This has been such helpful information. Thank you, Rachel. And again, if you have any questions that you either posted to the Q&A that we didn't get to, or that you think of after the webinar is complete, please contact us and I'll be sure to pass those along to Rachel to answer your questions. And just want to remind you that this episode and our previous Let's Keep Moving, the APDA episodes, are available on YouTube. So, and again, don't forget to subscribe to the APDA YouTube channel so that you don't miss future episodes. So we are looking forward to hearing from Tim Nordahl, a colleague of mine here at the Center for Neuro Rehab, next month. So stay tuned for registration information for that. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, take care, everybody.